Good evening. And welcome to First Lutheran Church. It's my joy to have you here this evening for the first in a series of conversations on some of the most critical issues of our age. So just easy stuff like climate change, polarization, and what to do with AI. And so it's fun to be able to lead you in this conversation tonight and to welcome others into that conversation as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Scholar in Residence Ken Chitwood. I'm here at First Lutheran Church for the next 3 months, and we're working in partnership with the University of Southern California's Center for Religion and Civic Culture on this project, where I'm also an affiliate researcher. Because we're addressing tough topics in a way over the next 3 events, this evening is going to open up some conversation. We're going to have a lot of time for Q&A and a lot of time for comments as well, and we want to welcome that because I think one of the most important things to do when it comes to these issues is to listen to one another. But in order to do that well, I want to suggest a few ground rules, or maybe just, ideas you might consider for how we might best listen to one another. And the first one is to listen attentively and be curious to other people. We have a tendency within us, and I'm like the worst culprit of this, to start formulating our own response and answer when someone else is speaking. So maybe put that on pause for an evening. You might find it liberating. I don't know. We're also going to try to allow everyone who wants to the opportunity to share. And so there's going to be plenty of time for that conversation. So don't feel the need to hold back. If you want to share, raise your hand. Be part of the conversation. And just in case it gets there, be sure to discuss ideas and not people. We can raise up people as examples or quote them or cite them, which I'll do as I share my own piece this evening. But if you start discussing things, be sure to discuss their ideas and not the people themselves. I ask this on my own behalf as well, as someone who will be up front. As you listen to other people, another thing to do is assume the best intentions. Right? Even if you disagree with someone, it's always very good to assume that they're coming from a good place. They're coming with a history at the very least. And so be sure to give them the benefit of the doubt, you might say. A couple more ideas is ask more questions, make less comments. That's always great for a conversational aspect. You're welcome to make comments. We're not trying to quash those or stop those, but maybe consider asking more questions than making comments. Avoid side conversations, okay? That's another thing we might try and emphasize. And then the last one is close the dialogue, which means make sure to not go on and on and on and on and on, okay? So we want to be sure to land at around, 60 seconds, 67 seconds if we're being generous. You might hear me start to clear my throat, nod in your direction, send eyeballs into the back of your head, and then at one point in time, if you're going on a little too long, I might redirect it back to the conversation with everyone as a whole. Another rule that we might all consider this evening is to explain where you're coming from. As I said earlier, when you are assuming the best intentions or assuming that someone has a story, you've got to understand that people didn't just arrive at opinions when they were born out of the womb. They've come to this place because of certain life events and certain histories and certain narratives in their past. And to start us this evening, I thought it would be good if I explained where I'm coming from and some of what I'm bringing to this conversation. The first thing I want to share is climate change is happening. Or as my collaborator this evening, Becca Estrada of California Interfaith Power and Light, who we'll hear from and about a little more later, said in her promo for this event, climate change is here. And I really appreciated the locality of that as well. Climate change is here in our age, but also here in Venice, in Los Angeles. NASA scientists report that there is unequivocal evidence that Earth is warming at an unprecedented rate, and that human activity is the principal cause thereof. While Earth's climate has fluctuated throughout history, the current season of warming is happening at a rate not seen in 10 millennia, 10,000 years. Scientific information taken from natural sources like ice cores and rocks and tree rings, recorded by satellites and processed by scientists with the aid of the most advanced computer processors the world has ever known, all point to one thing: a changing climate. From global temperature rise to melting ice sheets, glacial retreat to sea levels rising, the evidence of a warming planet abounds. How then shall we live when the earth is on fire? I am not a scientist. That's why I kept that part short and pointed to NASA scientists in particular. Nor do I pretend to be a scientist, but these facts came home to me while hiking the Franz Josef Glacier in New Zealand back in January 2008. Our guide, with his ginger dreadlocks and wraparound Oakleys, warned us not to walk too close to the glacier's face as it continued to sheave off massive chunks of ice into the glacial river that was flowing out in front of us. And almost as if to add an exclamation point to what he was saying, a massive man-sized lump broke off as we approached its western edge. You, the guide said, are watching climate change happen before your eyes. And that stuck with me. It upset me. And in that moment, as I watched the ice sheen away from a glacier that it had been a part of for centuries, for even thousands of years, I got a little sad for a piece of ice. I felt the pain of a piece of frozen water and saw in this falling ice a metaphor, perhaps, for our world, for us, for you, and for me. At the time, I returned to my church in New Zealand with questions and found not many answers, or resources, or even conversations among my fellow Christians. There were people with concerns. There were people with questions like mine. There were people doing individual work in their own spaces and vocations, but no one was convening a conversation. No one was taking the lead to ask the question we're asking tonight: how then shall we live? And it wasn't that the people in the church weren't aware or that they didn't care. The issue just didn't seem that urgent. I don't know. But again, I felt this pall of gloom come over me. If we don't care, if we don't do something, who will? And what will be done as the world is on fire? That lack of urgency and the lack of helpful resources I found in my search at the time raised an even more troubling question within me: whether people of faith could speak to this situation at all. Could they offer any positive examples or provide a path forward for others as we all navigate the changes in our climate futures? A friend and colleague of mine, Bron Taylor, is not so sure they can. Bron Taylor, just so you know, is a local boy. He was born in Long Beach, California in 1955. He lived most of his early years in South Pasadena and moved to Ventura, California, where he became a beach rat, quote unquote, and developed a love for the ocean. Bron and I first connected talking about surfing and waves and all the good stuff that comes with them. Later, he worked in the California State Park System, earned degrees from Chico State, Fuller Seminary, and USC. And he developed a keen passion for social and environmental activism, and he felt increasingly estranged from the evangelical culture that he was raised in. Today, this thoroughly native Californian is one of the world's leading scholars in the field of religion and nature. And it was in conversation with Bron that I first became aware of Lynn White Jr.'s 1967 essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. Anybody read Lynn White's essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis? Anybody have seen the late great Planet Earth? No? Crickets? Okay. So, what Lynn White said was that he claimed that the Judeo-Christian tradition, the tradition that a lot of you here tonight are familiar with, and especially Christians, had positioned humans as the most important element of existence and promoted subsequent environmentally destructive behaviors for centuries, and they seeded the roots of our contemporary ecological crisis. White's essay laid the fault of the ecological crisis at our feet, at my feet. In the decades that followed, White's essay, some argued that religious communities were becoming more environmentally friendly, and they called this the greening of religion. But in Bron's own article in 2016, some of his colleagues with him found that, to the contrary, religious communities and actors over the years that followed White's essay continued to hinder the environmental movement and actively contribute to climate change. This was largely thanks to certain theological orientations and beliefs about the role of divine agency in preventing or promoting natural events and the position of humanity within the grander cosmos, placing us usually smack dab at the center of it. They wrote, on balance, and notwithstanding the generally pro-environmental positions within indigenous traditions, we found the thrust of White's thesis is supported, whereas the greening of religion hypothesis, they called it, is not. Though they left the door open to the possibility of religious individuals and groups more effectively mobilizing and responding to contemporary environmental challenges, Braun largely believed it was not likely. Religious actors, he surmised, were not reliable partners in pursuing climate justice. Again, I was downcast, even a bit angry that my tradition, which had been so life-giving to me and others, a tradition that stood for a world redeemed, a cosmos that was created and cared for by God and his people, seemingly failed to react as the world burned around them. Since then, however, I've had opportunities to learn from some of those religious individuals who are making a difference, who are mobilizing their communities to do something, and who are providing some light on how we should live. Thanks to my work with various organizations that do interfaith work, I've been able to meet people from various religious traditions who are inspiring spiritual leaders, doing good when it comes to confronting the stark realities and deep injustices of climate change. One such individual is Tuanji Dietz, a Thai Buddhist social and environmental activist who has dedicated more than 4 decades of her life to working on sustainable agriculture practices with the hill tribes of northern Thailand. Another is David Rosen, former chief rabbi of Ireland and senior rabbi of the largest Orthodox Jewish congregation in South Africa, who helped found the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, a global multi-faith alliance that aims to bring moral urgency and faith-based leadership to efforts to stop forest degradation and save Earth's lungs. He's also a dedicated vegan who once told me that veganism is the new kosher for practicing Jews in a rapidly changing world, and he's quite adamant about that. I also need to mention grandmother Marie-Josée Rankin-Tardif of the Algonquin peoples, who pulled me aside at a World Congress in southern Germany to say that if we did not address climate change, there would be no point in addressing issues like education, poverty, gender justice, war, or nuclear proliferation. She asked me, what good will our efforts do for the world if there is no world to do good for? And finally, Rachel Mander, a 24-year-old evangelical from Sheffield, England, who, at age 19, started to see the connection between loving her neighbor and caring for creation. It's like looking for angels in the Bible, she told me. You don't notice how many there are until you actually look, and then you see them popping up everywhere. Me and my friends started re-examining scripture and seeing how being a person of faith means you care for the environment. Suddenly, she said, it was on every page. When I met Mander, she was one of the co-leaders of a 750-mile pilgrimage, 750-mile walking pilgrimage from the southwestern tip of the United Kingdom to Glasgow, Scotland, where that year's UN Climate Change Conference was being held. The Young Christian Climate Network organized about 2,000 people to make the walk. Convicted that the climate crisis is a pressing and urgent matter that must be resolved in this generation, the participants, mostly teenagers and people in their 20s, pled with church institutions, governments, and local congregations along the way to take concrete steps to reduce their carbon emissions, including calling for the Church of England to divest from fossil fuels. Then, in June 2023, Mander let me know that the Church of England had announced that they had done so. No longer would they profit from the fossil fuel industry with their investments. Mander and other evangelicals across the UK and beyond rejoiced at the news. These people, in the face of despondency and despair, give me hope. But there remains much work to be done. So where might we begin? How then shall we live? In his bracing new book, theologian Brian McLaren challenges readers to recognize the dangerous future into which we are presently plunging ourselves and our descendants and our fellow creatures, offering what he calls a creative path of resistance that prioritizes things like sacrifice, courage, kindness, and wisdom gleaned from our spiritual forefathers. McLaren also paints a pretty bleak scenario of our possible futures. There is perhaps, he surmises, not much we can do to avoid the worst of climate change and the potential collapse of civilization as we know it. It's a tough read, his book, but it's written for those waking up with that familiar, unpeaceful, uneasy, unwanted feeling about our civilization and planet. And Maclaren's ironically hopeful Jeremiad challenges readers to change their relationship to Earth and to one another. He promises that there is indeed life after doom, but he's unflinchingly honest about the environmental, economic, and political challenges our unstable and unsustainable global civilization faces. Resource wars, economic exploitation, and possible extinction as a species. And you thought you were going to have fun tonight. Is there a way out of the doom, he asks? Should we feel hope, despair, or a bit of both about our future? As I read this book just a few months ago, my own sense of doom started to return. And it turns out I'm far from alone. The effects of climate change can be terrifying, terribly demoralizing. Every day, news media deliver fresh images, videos, and headlines about climate-related disasters, devastating floods, disappearing lakes, a melting doomsday glacier, and the halting response of world leaders to act with urgency. It's no surprise that many of us are growing increasingly anxious about the perilous state of our planet. Mental health clinicians are seeing more patients come in with what they call climate change anxiety, also called eco-anxiety or eco-grief or climate doom, and they're not always sure what to do about it. It's a trend that's mirrored in public surveys and internet search data. In fact, Google searches for climate anxiety soared to 565% than the year before in 2021 alone. Perhaps you too have been feeling a bit anxiety, a bit of despair, this impending sense of doom and attendant sense of hopelessness. As part of my own spiritual practice in recent years and having dealt with anxiety my whole life, I took up the ancient Judeo-Christian tradition of lament. At its most basic, lament is an expression of sorrow, pain, or confusion. It's an expression of grief, of loss, of there's something not quite right, or this is not how things should be. And while cultures and communities have adopted various expressions and practices of grief over the years, tearing their clothes, bathing in ashes, wailing, or baking cakes and bringing them by the neighbor's house, the spiritual practice of lament invites us to express our sadness with a depth of grief for something lost, to voice frustration with events transpired, and protest the continuation of existing injustice. And that, I believe, is a biblical answer for a moment like ours. At least it's a start. In a culture still struggling with climate change denial or teetering on the brink of deep despair, lament offers what theologian Walter Brueggemann called a way for healing candor, or a way for healing honesty. That's because lament is a pattern and practice that encourages us to be honest and transparent about our frustrations and griefs. It's the opposite of willful denial or surrendering despair. It offers us the courage to face the beautiful as well as the broken. While there are religious actors who give me hope, and we might hear about more of them tonight, I've shared some of the stories I've encountered along the way. I don't believe hope is where we should begin. Perhaps it's step 2 or 3 in the process, a step that comes when we are ready to coax a new imagination of what could be into the world. But to be able to get there, I believe lament should be our first offering, a place to begin, to avoid unrealistic hope and the deepest despair, to have an honest, open conversation about what we might be able to do together in a world on fire, but recognizing what's happening already. Tonight, I believe, is an act of lament. It's an opportunity for us to create something new, to step in fresh directions, to do something together by first acknowledging what is missing and having a conversation so we might process our shared suffering, mourning, confusion, and consternation. The conversation we're having tonight may seem small and insignificant, like it won't add up to much, but it's something. And I'm grateful I get to help lead you through it. To also help us continue that conversation, we have Becca Estrada. Becca Estrada serves as the Southern California Director at California Interfaith Power and Light. Before joining CIPL, Becca served as the Director of Christian Life at the University of Southern California and pioneered a new role on campus as the first eco-chaplain at USC. That is pretty cool. She received her MDiv from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. Becca's passion about utilizing her agricultural upbringing and theological education to spark interfaith initiatives around spiritual practices, community building, and climate change. Her latest ecological project was designing an interfaith pilgrimage along the Los Angeles River. You can hear more of Becca's story in the mini documentary, Becca from Earth, now streaming on Vimeo, and I can highly recommend it. I watched it twice already, and it's fantastic. Will you welcome Becca this evening?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? It is so wonderful to be with you here in the beautiful city of Venice. I love coming to visit y'all in your beautiful ocean. I grew up very far away from the ocean in a small agricultural community. I grew up on a farm in Earth, Texas. Yes, Earth, Texas, population 1,000. Surrounded by all sorts of fields. Even my school was surrounded by cotton fields. It was a wild place to grow up, and I'm very grateful for my hometown. I was raised by generations of farmers. My dad, brother, and both grandparents were farmers, and my mom was a school teacher, and I had a wonderful childhood in Earth. I was a part of the community, a part of my church, and a part of the educational environment at my school. And all of these things shaped me in really profound ways. I would say the two biggest values that my family and community taught me was the value of caring for creation and living out your faith. Now, even though the Bible Belt and the area I grew up in may have a higher tendency of climate change denial, I still had a community with a deep love of the earth, its people, and you could see that in every area of their life. But as a young person, I also grew up with the reality and threat of climate change ever since I was young. Over and over again, climate change and the anxiety and fears that come with it followed me all through my upbringing. You know, what if this life that I grew up with, this environment, my family's farm, what if this way of life isn't possible in the upcoming future? It's a very scary question to ask, but it's one that we must ask. So, with climate change shaping my upbringing and my formative years, I eventually came to the conclusion that caring for the environment is living out my faith. These two values come together in unison. So, after some soul searching in seminary and my time as a chaplain at USC, I realized that I needed to make a change, that I needed to honor my family and agricultural community and honor the reality that climate change is here. So I left my position as a chaplain, and now I work as a full-time faith leader and climate advocate with California Interfaith Power and Light. So let me tell you a little bit about our organization. California Interfaith Power and Light represents 750 congregations throughout the state of California. We even have some member congregations here in Venice, right in y'all's neighborhood. Yes. We resource all different communities of faith in three primary ways. We help them with climate education, climate advocacy, and of course, taking bold climate action. This can look like educational events or conversations like this today. I hope today is a very educational experience for all of us. We also do advocacy and help educate people of faith about upcoming policies and legislation that is up for voting that will impact our environment so we, as community of faith, can respond. And lastly, we want to live out our faith by living sustainably. I help congregations install solar panels, do composting with their food outreach ministry, or even become resilience hubs so they can respond to the community during times of natural disaster. The reason why the faith community is so important to this reality of climate change is climate change impacts vulnerable communities first. It hits them first and it hits them hardest. So climate change is going to impact the elderly, the poor, our children, our next generation, our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness. These are the people that are the most at risk for the natural disasters that are coming, and they are coming. So what will we do as communities of faith? How will we care for our neighbor and care for creation and care for the vulnerable? So as people of faith or no faith, what shall we do? How shall we live? I'm so grateful that you brought me here to wrestle with this question with you. So let's explore this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becca, for being here this evening. Giovanni is going to come and get the podium out of the way for everyone so you can see us and you don't have to dodge it. I'm really inspired by what I've seen so many different congregations be doing, and a lot of folks here are part of congregations or part of communities. And so from your work with California Interfaith Power and Light, could you maybe raise a few examples that you've seen where you're really inspired by the work they're doing, either in their own community with their own church, in advocacy, or some of those three key areas you mentioned that you're working in?
Yeah, absolutely. The project that I'm working closest with, I'm working with a congregation in Compton to become a resilience hub for the neighborhood. That involves gaining solar and backup battery. I'm applying for funding for the backup battery currently. And ultimately, we are hoping that we can use the church's facilities as a way for people to still have access to power and electricity during rolling blackouts. We are also hoping to install high-quality air purification systems and great air conditioning to be so that during times of wildfire season or smoky season, people who don't have central AC can come and have pure air and cool air to live in, so that during these disasters, just to help the community be more resilient, so they have that cultural hub within their neighborhood. Another important thing that I want to point out is we are hosting a lobby day in Sacramento on June 4th. We have about 20 to 25 members of faith throughout the state of California that are coming to the capital, or Sacramento, the state capital, to educate our legislators about climate policies that will protect our neighborhoods from toxic oil drilling and other important issues related to public health and climate disasters. And then I think this conversation here is a great example of the type of education that we do. So thank you so much for being, leaders in this area.
Yeah, and one of the things we wanted to do tonight was have a lot of time for Q&A, and we're going to be getting to that from y'all in just a moment. But we also talked about some questions we wanted to kind of have a conversation around as well. And you already brought this up kind of as you were sharing, and I'll share my perspective on it as well in a moment, perhaps. But there's this tension that I sometimes see between what do I do and the stress that comes with like, well, if I don't know how to recycle this or throw this away, or if I don't buy an electric vehicle, or if I have to drive to work instead of taking public transportation here in LA, maybe it takes too long or I can't get to where I'm going. Like this tension between individual responsibility and then corporate responsibility, between what an individual congregation or person does and then this lobbying work and this advocacy work that you talk about. When people think, what can I do? Do you place emphasis more on one over the other, or encourage both? Or how do you encourage people to navigate that, Becca?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I know the weight of climate change can be so heavy on our shoulders. And first off, I just want to say this loud and clear that you, as individuals, or even as this small faith community, you did not cause climate change. There are huge corporations that have made massive profits by just over-consuming resources from the environment for decades. And none of us have the full weight of climate change on our shoulders. None of us individually are to blame, but all of us are called to be a part of the solution, and all of us can take actions in small and meaningful ways. In terms of individual responsibility, I even want to push back on that a little bit, because the more that we look and think as a community, the more that we realize that we are responsible to care for our neighbors as we care for ourselves, and that it's poor communities, vulnerable communities that are the most at risk. And I'm saying that, as us who live in a very wealthy nation, we are the ones who have emitted the most carbon into the atmosphere. We have contributed the most, and yet it's other communities that are experiencing the effects of climate change the most severely. And so there is a call to action that we as individuals can do, but when we think more as a community and caring for our neighbors and caring for our planet, that's the kind of mindset that I hope that we would have to motivate us to make these changes in our lives and in our families.
I think that's really excellent. I appreciate you pushing back on this notion of individual responsibility, because that's one thing I see with people, is that they are often and sometimes limited as individuals based on the context within which they are or within which they were raised. And so there's a struggle, whether you're well-resourced and you're born into an affluent community, or you're under-resourced and you're born into a less affluent community. That context may constrain what you can do, right? Depending on what city you live in may determine whether or not you can take public transportation, or how you might be able to dispose of waste, or how much waste you might have to dispose of. When we talk about sustainable food practices, again, what's available in your neighborhood? How much does it cost? How much do you have in the bank? There's a lot of different things that can limit and constrain people. And so that's why I think the advocacy part that you mentioned is so important, to be able to advocate for governments to change their systems, and for us to be part of that process. But also to try to influence corporations, right? And to see them change their practices, whether that's from the inside, because maybe we work for those corporations, and we're part of those systems, or as consumers, right? And not getting too caught up in kind of consumer culture, but also using what power we have as consumers to perhaps make different choices and send a message that we don't want to purchase things that are made in this way. And I also appreciated what you had to say about not thinking individually. I think that's really fantastic. One of the things I learned, and this has become a bit tired from people like myself who have learned this, but I really did find it powerful. When I was living in South Africa, one of the proverbs that was passed on to me while I was there is an Nguni proverb of Umuntu Gumuntu Gabantu, which means a person is a person through other persons. And this is a basis of what some of you might be familiar as Ubuntu philosophy, Desmond Tutu, and reacting to apartheid. But this was the idea that we cannot make decisions individually without thinking for others. And our choices impact our neighbor by the very fact that we are neighbors. And that's true locally in Venice and Mar Vista and Palisades, but also beyond that to the other side of the world. And I talked earlier about having these feelings for a glacier, right? But I also have this practice, and this is a practice of lament that I use, that when I read about natural disasters, rather than flipping on my phone or turning the page on a newspaper, do any of you use that ancient technology anymore, a newspaper? If you don't. But rather than turning past it, I stop and I try to cultivate a sadness about it, at the very least, to be able to connect with what's happening in another part of the world. And that's happened often as I'm a native Californian and I've watched fires happen here and tear apart communities and landscapes that I remember and loved from my childhood and growing up. And I'm in Germany watching it from far away and saying, oh, I'm feeling with these people, but also cultivating that with others. And that communal identity, the fact that I can't absolve myself of this if I do certain things, if I travel less myself, or if I recycle more, if I use reusable bags, or if I eat the right foods, then I've at least made myself forgiven for the sins of climate change. But perhaps I am not absolved of it until my neighbor is also free from it. Yeah. Anything to kind of bounce back on that, or any other ideas kind of around this idea of individual and corporate communal responsibility?
Yeah, that was really beautifully said. I would also add just to reflect on, this individualistic American culture that's, prevalent in this room. Another identity that we collectively hold, or that we, are often operate as, is as consumers. We have this mentality that resources are abundant. None of us are worried about water coming out of the faucet, even though we live, in a state that has experienced severe droughts. And this mental shift, I think, is really important for us as a community because, reduce, reuse, recycle, we really don't lean too far into the reduce side of things. There's power in saying no and, being aware of what you consume and how you consume it. I was also a part of, I think about certain, faith traditions, whether it's, the Buddhist tradition, or I also hold a Mennonite identity, and this idea of simple living and living in relationship with nature. We're meant to be in a community, not only with humans, but with also animals, plants, creation. We are kin to nature. And when we can break that viewpoint and go from consumer to kinship, then our relationship with these, so-called resources just comes from a different place. We're no longer consuming, we're valuing, we're utilizing, we're caring for the environment.
I really appreciate you kind of helping us enlarge our circle of care, if I could put it in that way, or our ethic of care, beyond ourselves, beyond our nuclear family, beyond the people we bump into every day. And maybe we don't care for the people we literally bump into every day on the freeway or on the roads or whatever, but expanding the kind of, the community we count ourselves as part of, not only beyond our local area, but also to the very world, the very material world that we're set within. To move on to another question that we had on our list that's really related to this, what have you seen, or what might you encourage in terms of how to actually care for one another in the midst of this change, especially as we're seeing vulnerable communities? What can we do as a community of people, or as a congregation, to be able to advocate for or to actually care for people in the midst of this? I mean, we don't want to come in with some savior complex. So how can we actually be caring while not being overbearing, perhaps?
Yeah, I would say starting from a posture of listening is huge. I loved, your earlier example of not scrolling past the news article about a community being devastated by floods or wildfire or famine. These are our neighbors. These are, to put it in the Christian worldview, these are other people made in the image of God, and we need to honor their life and even their suffering. And I know that that can be an overwhelming or just emotionally taxing experience. And so I would say, first off, have the courage to look at those stories and to see the people behind them, but also care for yourself in terms of giving space for lament, for anger, because it's all of these experiences that are going to lead you to action. There comes a point where we say, enough is enough. I can't take any more of the way we've been doing things. We need to change. And with that note, I also really want to encourage us to listen to the voices of the younger generation, because this is the world that they are inheriting. They have so much at stake, and ultimately they're going to be tasked with leading us into a brighter future. And I think the more that we can listen to young people and support their vision for a healthy and thriving environment and planet, the more we can get behind them and do our part to care for creation thoughtfully and sustainably. I'm always encouraging people to listen to young people.
Yeah, I shared this story of Rachel Mander earlier, who I was assigned this story, so I didn't find her, but I was told by my editor, like, hey, I'm hearing about this thing, and there's this person, and you should talk to her. And I said, sounds like a great story. I'm gonna go do it. And then I'm doing the interview and being all like professional journalist and doing my thing, and I'm finding myself so very moved by Rachel and the people around her. And she was on this like Zoom call at some congregation they'd stopped in to sleep at for the night, and just the raw power that they had in what they were doing and the effort they were giving to be part of this 750-mile relay pilgrimage, but also with the intention of, we are going to go speak to the UN. We're going to go make this happen. And one of the principal things we want to do is also talk to all these churches along the way about how they should urge the Church of England as a whole to divest from fossil fuels. And they weren't the only people doing this, but they were part of a community of folks doing it. And a year later, it was done. And that's major. I mean, you think about the Church of England worldwide, divesting from fossil fuels, that is no small thing. This is a multi-billion-dollar organization. And, I often say, in Lutheran communities, in lots of religious communities, change is a four-letter word, right? Like it offends our ears and our senses. And to think about changing an entire worldwide church structure, I was not only inspired by Rachel, but all those around her for what they actually did. And it underscored for me what I've long said since I first studied education. We often say children are our future, young people are our future. They are the present. They are the leaders in this moment. And so be able to sit at their feet and to listen to them is a really powerful thing. So I appreciate you underscoring that.
Yeah, and one thing I would like to add before, we keep conversation going. I think so much of the rhetoric around climate action is focused in a negative framework. It's things that we have to sacrifice or give up, or I can't eat meat, I can't drive my gas-powered car, all of these things. And I guess I think people of faith have something to offer in the value of sacrifice, of thinking about what we consume and what we take from the earth. But also, we're people of hope as well. Like, there are so many opportunities for us to live in a better way, in a healthier way, that's good for our bodies and our planet. It doesn't have to be all sacrifice and, things being taken away from me or my freedoms being limited. No, I was speaking with my students at USC about climate change and this idea of, things always being taken away. But I was like, what opportunities have been brought about because of climate change? For myself, when I moved to California, I took up gardening as a way to stay in touch with creation, and that has been a huge addition to my life. It brings so much self-care, it brings fresh produce. Like, this is a positive addition to my life. One of my students talked about how she learned the metro system and gained this sense of freedom and confidence for navigating the city. She gained a tool because she was trying to live sustainably and take culture or climate change seriously. So there are real opportunities that do involve change, but it can be change for the better.
I'm going to ask you a question on my own behalf. As I shared, I can be a bit of a downer about this sometimes, and I'm pretty good at it, being a downer in general. My wife Paula likes to call me a professional pessimist, and I don't think she's too far off. I like to call myself a paid realist, perhaps. But I find myself being pretty, just kind of angsty and not happy and depressed about the future, and sometimes in my worst moments thinking, God, I hope I die soon because I don't want to experience the worst of what's to come, but what's to come for people who come after me, and I get pretty upset about it. And so I asked you, you mentioned hope, you mentioned the positives. Are you pretty hopeful about things, less than hopeful about things? What could you share from your own perspective about that?
So when I read that question preparing for this talk, I think that was the most difficult question on the list. It made me stop in my tracks. It punched me in my gut. Like, do I have hope in the midst of a changing climate, in the midst of a climate crisis? And the honest answer is not every day. I don't have hope every day. I think it varies based on subjects or climate action. Like, for example, do I have hope at this point that we are going to stay under the 1.5 C that, the Paris Agreement set out as a goal? We're not on track to do that. I don't have hope that that will be our reality, and I am gearing up to realize that we're going to learn the hard way and not the easy way. But at the same time, as a person of faith, I do have hope. My faith gives me a sense of hope, whether it's faith in humanity, faith in God, faith that good will triumph over evil. My faith does provide that for me. And then on the days where I don't have hope, sometimes I have to just live in faith that, good things are happening outside of my control, outside of, my emotional state. So my faith both provides hope, and then my faith is also there for me when I don't have hope. And, but I will say, I have been described as annoyingly optimistic, and that has also greatly helped me as a person who deals with climate change every day. So I do think that is a superpower, a God-given gift in this role.
Yeah, good for you. That's good. We're a good yin and yang, perhaps, on that. So that's fantastic. Yeah, I think when I think about this too, and I'm sorry to introduce a gut punch question. It's like, hosting an event 101, you don't want to make your speaker uncomfortable, and whoops. But I think about that, and people have often asked me about this topic, but many other things. And I always turn back to this word from my tradition and a lot of ours as well in Scripture that talks about faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these being love. And we often read that in one direction, but I read that in another direction sometimes and say, well, when I'm lacking faith And when I'm lacking hope, then what maybe I should lean into is love. That if I can't believe it today, if I can't hope for it today, then the best I'm left with, and I hear is also the best thing to lean into, is that love. And that brings me back to, well, care for your neighbor, listen to your neighbor, learn from your neighbor, lean into their stories, and try to connect with them. And I look to other people like some of the folks I mentioned earlier, or organizations like CIPL and others who are doing the work, or Rachel Mander in the UK and her team of young climate activists. And I think, okay, I can learn from them, I can benefit from their love they're giving to this project, and then maybe that installs a little bit of hope in me again, and maybe that brings back a little bit of belief that we might be able to do something. And so that's something I kind of turn to in that. We could go on talking back and forth a lot and continue on with a long list of questions, but we want to open this up to others now. We have Giovanni and Rachel who have volunteered to burn calories this evening and be our roaming mics. And so you don't have to come up front. We're not going to put that pressure on you. We're going to invite you to raise your hands, and then Giovanni or Rachel will come to you. Again, this is a time for you to react to what we've shared, some of the perspectives we've offered. We want to also cede some time for you to be able to share those things, but this is also a time for questions for one another, questions for us. We just want to have an open and honest conversation. And we want to leave as much time as possible for as many to be able to ask that question. And Klaus is first up.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being here tonight and bringing up this very, very...
Oh, yeah, sorry. You're next.
Okay. That's okay, Jack? Okay. I have a question. I'm a pragmatist, and I like to always hinge on the topic which helped me. What you can measure, you can't... What you can measure, you can improve. And I would like to know from you and your experience, particularly, Rebecca, to find out what are the areas, where you find change, particularly climate-related change, which has both a benefit of something which is fun, which is good, which is fun to do rather than a deep sacrifice. And the other one is where you sacrifice together in a team or in a community or as a church, where can we show how we saved, I don't know, plastic bags, or I don't know, I lived in a condominium once where we made it explicit that we changed water and had less water, every month less water, because people could use it, less showers, etc. So again, the incentive of showing something which is successful. I just wanted to see what are the low-hanging fruits from your point of view in that matter.
Yeah. Okay, I know you asked two questions. Could you repeat the first one and I'll answer that first?
Yeah, these two questions relate again to what we can measure, we can improve. The one is you mentioned earlier that you have some ideas of climate changes which have truly a benefit for a fun or immediate positive result, which doesn't necessarily mean a big sacrifice. The other one, which I like to do, where a sacrifice is needed, where have you be able to get that out of some sort of maybe team effort to join together in something and measure something together, see the results of that, and say, hey, why didn't that work? Or how can we improve that? And enjoy the success in that.
So a practical step that both one involves sacrifice, the other one maybe not so much.
Sort of a fun competition.
Fun, yes. Let's see. I would say, to give a communal example, our national organization, Interfaith Power and Light, each year they host a friendly competition called Cool Congregations, which is an opportunity for churches to become more sustainable in different areas. So you track all the different ways that you reduce your energy use or there's a whole list of things that we can help you track, and you can become certified as a cool congregation.
I love it. I love it.
And in this competition, we actually give a $1,000 grant to our top congregation in our various categories so that you can continue to be sustainable faith leaders. In terms of maybe some more individual at-home practices, I'll share a couple off the top of my head. Switching to LED light bulbs to be more energy efficient, thrifting instead of purchasing firsthand. I think it's also important, when you're grocery shopping, look at the type of materials that things are packaged in. See if you can limit the amount of single-use plastic in food packaging, on and on. And ultimately, that is a great topic of conversation to have amongst yourself. I meet friends or, network with other climate leaders, and I continue to learn these small, fun hacks about things that I can do in my daily life to be more sustainable. And so, yeah, have that be a conversation in your community. Be curious, share your tips. I can share more of mine, but I would, love to challenge you as a community to be thinking about it. In terms of maybe something that's more on the sacrificial side, I would say me being an optimist, you're going to get a sacrifice and a positive thing. At USC, our communal events with all the different religious and spiritual clubs, we moved all of our catering to be vegan, and it really is the new kosher. Vegan meals accommodate for every religious dietary restriction or accommodation. It helps with food allergies, and even though limiting, meat and animal products is a sacrifice, it can also be healthy and a way for you to share a meal with your neighbor. And so, even if there are these sacrifices, I think if we're honest, moving to a more sustainable society is going to cost us money, or it is going to be something that we have to fight and advocate for, within our public policy. I think there will be a lot of time sacrificed in this, but there's also going to be great opportunities for jobs. There's going to be amazing opportunities for people to have clean air to breathe in our very smoggy city, and so on. There's so many great benefits to living in a sustainable world, but we have to adapt, and change in and of itself is difficult and often feels like a sacrifice, even though it can be an open door for something positive.
Yeah, I really appreciate you talking about the Cool Congregations competition, alliterative, love it.
Please join.
But there's also in the Church of England, not to double dip into that representative body, but they have an eco-congregation certification.
Yeah.
And there's like a big checklist that you can go through, and that's very measurable. I think that's really helpful about that, is it helps people get minds around, okay, do this, do that, get these numbers to that level, etc. Another cool thing that I've seen kind of gaming this is friends in certain circles in Europe will all commit to like an accountability app where you measure your travel, and you can even do it with your phone, so people can see how much you're traveling, and then they shame each other into how much they've flown or traveled by car, and like they're having these conversations with each other. But it's a really cool way to share and connect over vast distances, and it's helped people reduce their carbon footprint in some measurable ways, which I think is a really cool thing. And then earlier, we've hit on the younger generation, but younger generations are cool, and as I increasingly get older, I feel disconnected And so I want to point to how like older generations as well can be very significant in this. You mentioned earlier how reusing clothes or maybe not going and buying new clothes, etc. Like so many younger people don't know how to fix clothes. It's something that has been a lost art. And I've seen these intergenerational activities where older folks are teaching younger children how to repair clothes, how to reuse things, how to fix tables or chairs or whatever, passing on those skills that perhaps some of you grew up with to younger generations can be a measurable way to help younger generations learn to better reuse and reduce their waste. So that's another great way to be involved.
Yeah.
But we're done talking. We've got another question from Chuck Giovanni.
I use a microphone, but I use a naval officer, and you don't need to have a microphone because you just yell. So I'll try it without. Pardon? I'm told to use it. My question is a big question mark. I hear all this noise, and I think it's good noise and bad noise. What can be either of those? Climate change is changing things. And I say, okay, you want to change things, but to what do you want to change it? Now, if you look at the Earth's history, at one time, our whole environment was full of soil, and it killed all living things. Other times, we had deserts, and the polar bears had a fit. Then when we had the glaciers, the people who wanted to go out and get a suntan and nice weather went crazy. So I'd like to know when I hear we gotta get a change, we gotta change, to what climate are we to go? Now, for a young lady who grew up in Texas, do you want a climate where there are no tornadoes, where there are no big ice storms, where it's constantly one temperature? Do you think the people in Seattle are going to have a fit when all of a sudden their rainforest dries up? What about the people in very small or in climates like Africa, the Sahara? Do you want them to go back to a time was a very wet climate? I don't hear specific directions where you want to go. And the answer, I think, to that question is really any road will take you any place. Which road do you want to go to? Which temperatures, which rainfall, which wind do you want? And you think the whole world will subscribe to whatever you select.
Thank you for that. Becca, do you want to pick up on that about, different parts of the world where climate is changing and people are talking about moving to different places, talking about what the loss is going to be, but then also what power do we have in terms of what direction our climate changes into as it continues to change? Anything you want to respond to from that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, my hope is that we don't have to move and relocate, that we can change our, habits as a society and continue to love the place where we grew up and were raised. And, we don't have to sacrifice the place, the culture, the identity that is given to you by growing up in a specific location. To address, if I'm understanding correctly, this idea of climate migration, like where will we go in the midst of climate change? I'm not a scientist, so I have some vague answers. I could research and maybe get you something more specific. But first off, let me start with a personal story. So I grew up in West Texas, a very flat area that was, according to our, elementary school textbook, we were supposed to be grasslands when actually our precipitation levels, at this point, were in desert degrees, or were in the desert levels. And I was like, that's weird. We should be getting more rain according to my 5th grade textbook. And then our main source of water outside of rain is I lived over the largest underground aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer. I loved saying that name as
That's
a
a
kid.
tongue twister. Yeah.
Still do. And, I grew up in a severe drought that had a strong impact on not only my community, but even my family's income as farmers. It was a very stressful time. And the drought persisted long enough that my dad decided to relocate our family and move to Houston because it has a, for now, more reliable water source, which now he has to deal with hurricanes and an overabundance of water. So I guess he switched one problem for another. But it wasn't until more recently that I realized, oh, my family has already experienced climate migration. We have already, suffered enough from a drought, from overuse, from taking too much from the aquifer. It was getting too low. I grew up hearing risks about what if the water dries up in the aquifer. It was a real scary reality that we had to face and questions we had to ask. And people of privilege will be the people who are able to move and to get to more comfortable spaces and to stay in more livable zones. Yet it's, the elderly, the poor who won't have the resources or the luxury to get up and change. And, that once again points to the inequity that climate change has. So I'm very concerned about climate migration. We don't do very well with immigration or any of that here in the United States. And so I think learning how to be hospitable, or ideally learning how to, take better care of where you are is the easier way to go, and the way that I would challenge us to move. Instead of thinking about relocating to a different part of the country, or you've heard talks about us seeing if life on Mars is possible. Like, that is a way worse solution and a more expensive solution. So yeah, I think, finding ways to better care for where we are now is just going to prevent so much of the change that you were asking about.
Thank you for sharing that personal story of your own family's background, which comes out in the documentary as well. And I think that's really powerful to again locate ourselves in these stories amidst the conversations about where the change is going to take us. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
Hi. So it seems to me that I can think of all sorts of little things that I can do. I can stop using baggies, and I can buy organic, and I can cut back on my meat consumption and all this kind of stuff, and that's good. And I have the resources that I can spend more on my food to buy more wisely. But I'm thinking about the big stuff. We need some governments to get on board. And our own government, but other governments. Ours is not the only government that's dragging their feet on things. And is there hope there? That's what really upsets me. I have hope that I can make some changes and probably influence some people I know. But how do we influence the big things or the big corporations and so forth? That's my question.
Yeah, I would say, get involved with your community, whether it's at the local level. Sometimes it's easier to enact change when you get involved with your, city town hall meetings. You have a lot of power and influence there. Or joining an environmental justice organization, whether that's California Interfaith Power and Light or another, wonderful organization. There's lots of communities that can give you practical steps to take. Like, for example, today I was working on a newsletter that we're about to send out, and it's about an opportunity for people of faith to endorse a campaign that we are a part of. It's the campaign for a safe and healthy California, which is fighting to keep Senate Bill 1137, which has to do with restrictions around oil and gas drilling and the pollution that's impacting the communities. And so there are organizations such as California Interfaith Power and Light that are staying on top of these issues, that are trying to educate people such as yourself and provide opportunities. So, you know, find a way to get involved that works for you. I'm happy to, if anyone wants my business card, we can follow up. I can sign you up for our newsletter. There's lots of opportunities to get plugged in if that's encouraging.
Yeah, and one of the cool things about CIPL is it represents a diverse coalition of people who are concerned about this issue. And I think diverse coalitions are particularly powerful politically. When you hear from one constituency, if they're like higher in numbers for a particular politician in their area, they might care. But when you have multiple constituencies across the different demographic points that you see in poll information, like a particular religion or a particular ethnic background or a particular socioeconomic background, if you're able to isolate those, that's much easier for politicians to kind of break down and consider whether or not it's worth their time to care. And diverse coalitions that break across those different demographic divisions are particularly powerful. And so grab neighbors that don't think or act like you, and find the things that you agree on about climate change and advocate together. Be annoying together. Raise your voice together, right? And I say that being annoying part very specifically because I was part of drafting this document at this big international gathering called Religions for Peace International. And we were drafting the statement for the organization saying this is going to be our kind of reason for existing for the next several years. And it was seen as a very important document by this community. And I was the principal drafter of this. And I had a lot of people talking to me about what should be first, what should be first, what should be like, where are the paragraphs going to be organized? It was like sitting in a room of 500 different editors. It was my living nightmare. But there were these people that kept coming up and saying what I shared earlier from Sister Marie, who said, or Grandmother Marie, she said, again, if we don't do something about climate change, all these other issues, all these other things are going to pale in comparison. And Becca's already connected it to immigration. If we care about immigration, we care about climate change. If we care about gender justice, we care about climate change. If we care about poverty, we care about climate change. And so it's concerning to me, I think, as an individual, when I look at then opinion polls and in terms of urgency around elections, climate change is still very down the list, right? And that shifted for me at this Religions for Peace thing because people kept coming up and saying, we need to prioritize this, we need to be talking about this. And they annoyed me so much that I put it first on the list, right?
Thank you.
And people finally got it through to me. And I wasn't of the opinion because I was like, immigration, or like I was about like this conflict, or I was about particular things in my experience. But people were able to get together, and so many different voices came and bugged me that I changed it on that paragraph. Now, that didn't change the world. But maybe if you found someone more powerful and important and influential than Ken Chitwood, it might, right? Other questions, comments, queries, consternations? Yeah, Doug.
Thank you, Pastor Ken, for putting this together and for the fabulous speaker attending. Jesus had a few disciples that were fishermen, and my father happened to be a fisherman. Actually, he jokingly said that, but he was a marine scientist. And he was the first person to tell me about climate change in the early 1980s. He supplied specimens all around the world and was talking to the lead scientists around, and they were all on the same page about this, decades ago. But before that happened, he stopped. He found out that the pollution problem, and it has a lot to do with climate change, is pollution. The problem that was plaguing the Santa Monica Bay wasn't organic; it was a synthetic, and that synthetic was DDT. So he stopped the dumping of DDT, and I'm wondering what you've done about correlating pollution with climate change. You've mentioned fossil fuels, and sewage disposal in the bay. And it's not only the organic sewage, it's the synthetics that go with the sewage and that create an imbalance in the ocean, and you lose kelp and marine life that can provide oxygen and clean water because the imbalance gets too great and too severe. And the other part of the question is, we can't, as a church, endorse a candidate, but when you're talking about policies and going around, can we speak, promote policies for climate change and pollution problems? Thank you.
Thank you, Deb.
Yeah, so I would say with the congregations that we are working with currently, they are more inland, and so there has been more of a focus with air pollution. I'm not aware of anything that we have currently going on. Unfortunately, I would have to ask my predecessors about things that our organization has done to address DDT or other more marine life pollution. So sorry, I don't have a good example in that for our organization, but if Venice or this community wants to get involved with something, we would be happy to do our best to resource you, equip you. We are here for, people like you. So please be in partnership with us, be in conversation with us. Sorry, what was your second question?
Promoting policies or encouraging people to vote for policies that help fight the climate change.
Yeah, so, 501c3s like churches, like our organization, can't promote or endorse specific candidates, but we can provide education and point people to policies and ballot measures that do relate to climate. Like, for example, the oil and gas drilling, that is a ballot measure that is going to be, a part of this election. And so we're trying to educate people of faith about it, and so they can, vote in a way that aligns with their values. Does that answer your question, or did you want me to go in depth something? Yeah, thank you.
Discuss that in the church.
Yeah, and if you're interested, we are having a Zoom meeting about the policies that we are lobbying for on June 4th, but we decided to open up that meeting to people so that they can be more educated about the policies and legislation that we are trying to have a positive influence on. You can also, if you're not able to travel with us to Sacramento, we have resources to help you call your representative and join us in advocacy in that way. So we have resources, that are ready for any of you to jump in. Please be a subscriber.
Yeah, if I could yes and that. I was listening to a bishop in Nigeria one time dealing with a very difficult conflict. And this wasn't climate change, but still a very serious issue. And I think one of the most helpful things he said, and this came from his tradition as a bishop within a Christian tradition, but he said, this isn't this tribe's problem, this isn't this tribe's problem, it's a human sin problem, right? And so he took it from us, them, to all of us have the same problem here. And I always think of that when I think of elections. And we might say, this isn't a Republican problem, this isn't a Democrat's problem. This is a human problem, right? And again, diverse coalitions. I think beyond just being a 501c3 and not endorsing particular candidates, again, this isn't where one party is doing better than another. And we shouldn't be thinking about it in those terms. We should be thinking about what can we do together as a community? What can we do to build diverse coalitions to be able to solve this problem together? And so I think focusing on policies is a great way to be able to do that, to find common ground on it as well. And I think about it again, this isn't their problem, this isn't our problem, this is a shared problem that we're all addressing together. Other reflections, comments, things from Rachel or Giovanni?
I'm glad you brought up the sin problem, because what I was going to say is, you have your practice of lament, And I have a similar practice when I'll hear things where it's very easy to say, like, if these oil companies would just stop, you know what I mean? And you get into that kind of mindset, and I just have to sit back and say, but for them to change is going to require them to lose something that's precious to them. Standing, domination, control, money, jobs, an identity, all of these things. And what does it feel like to have to lose something? And in many ways, it's easier to never have had it and long for it, because then at least you have hope that one day you might get it, versus having it and losing it and knowing you're never going to get back. And so I guess my question is, as I think about this, and Ken, this is probably more for you and in your historical studies, but maybe not, Becca, you might know too. Is there an example in human history of people in control, in power, in domination over resources, yielding for the common good before they're forced to?
I immediately went to books that provide myriad examples of them not. Again, professional pessimist. But this is an excellent question. And I don't, maybe you can come in as the optimist on this one, Becca, but I think there's been really helpful books that, again, like with Brian McLaren's book, he's pointing towards the doom that we might be facing as a civilization. And there's also a bunch of authors talking about how have we seen civilizations collapse in the past, and what can we learn from how they dealt with the collapse of their civilization. So I don't think I can think of any examples of people changing direction before it got too bad at a societal level, but once that society collapsed, they said, oh, what might we learn here? And again, being a pessimist, I would say, well, okay, if things change, and again, the marks, we're missing every mark. We're missing every chance. We're doing everything that we shouldn't be. And if it is loss that we're facing, then what might we learn from those who have lost before? And I'm blanking on the name of the one particular book from a guy out in Texas at Baylor University. I can remember his university, but I can't remember his name. I'll try to remember it and suggest it to you and others as well. I think there are some better historians who can look at those examples, but I can't think of any that changed course before it got to the worst part. Becca, it's on you.
Well, as a theologian instead of a historian, I think of passages of scripture in the Old Testament that point to, world leaders, being faced by a prophet, or, I was recently in a Bible study about the story of Jonah, and the story of Jonah, was presented with an opportunity to do good, and what started the chain reaction was the king, tearing his clothes, putting on ash, practicing lament, and that led the way for, the rest of the nation to do that. And so, I want to point that out as an affirmation for each of you as a person that belongs to the faith community, or those in the room that belong to a faith community. You have stories of hope and transformation within your history to point people to help shape our collective imaginations. And also, going back to the practical things that we can do, we also have a voice of influence with our current leaders. When I go to lobby days, I talk with a representative and say, hey, I represent 20 faith communities in your district that are concerned about this. And what's important about our voice in particular is we can be a voice, the moral voice for justice, and say, hey, we need to do this difficult thing because it's the right thing to do, because people will suffer if we don't do it. And so we have that really important angle to bring to the table to people in positions of power. So please, use your voice for climate justice as a faith person. It's so needed.
Appreciate you bringing up this prophetic example. That's a really, really powerful one. Thank you, Becca. One more question or comment from y'all, and we can continue the conversation after we officially close, but is there anybody else who wanted to voice or ask. Yes, please. Yeah.
Well, I don't have any questions particularly, only really suggestions.
Perfect.
Just a couple things that popped into my mind as I was listening to everybody else's questions. Our voices are so important.
Closer to your mouth, because I can't understand.
All right.
Oh.
A couple things that I just thought of as I was listening to your questions is petitions. We have phones now to, surf the internet and look at different news articles and whatnot. Change.org has so many good petitions for us to sign to use our voices to make change. And especially through social media, we can look at these things and search up things and really come together to make change. The one I thought of was the Willow Project. That was, I don't know if anybody else heard about it. It was huge, of course. That's like the thing I think about when I think of people of my generation coming together to stop things bad happening. Sign petitions and like really use your voice to push our government to do better.
Yeah.
Protect the planet. I don't really have anything else to say.
I think that's really helpful to think again about how we can connect with others, how we can learn from others, join forces with others. So I appreciate you bringing up some concrete examples and little tools we can use as well.
Yeah, and just to, affirm everything you're saying, like young people are doing what they can to use their voice, to use their influence, to use their, political power as, a citizen of this country to make change. And something that I realized, I was in a meeting with a bunch of Episcopal leaders, and we were talking about, the big things that we could do for being sustainable and for, making sure that we are moving to a more electric, less carbon dependent world. And as I was sitting there, I was listening to all of these elders and adults that were talking about their church facilities and their homes. And it struck me as a younger person who lives, who is currently renting and all these things. I was like, wow, people who own homes or own properties or have access to beautiful buildings such as this have a call to action to green their facilities, to go solar, to do all these things that I myself I'm currently not positioned to do any of that. And so, I just want to, one, affirm your call to be involved politically. Young people are doing everything they can, so please follow their lead, sign petitions, be an active citizen and be involved in your government, but also think about, the privilege that you may have as a homeowner, as a person who can, switch to an electric vehicle. All of these changes are needed, and there is this inequity that we have to navigate. And so, just, affirm those who are playing a part in one way. Think of all the different hats you can wear in doing this work. It's really important.
Fantastic. You thank Becca Estrada for being here tonight. I'm so thankful for Becca answering a random guy from the internet's email and being willing to come here tonight, be part of this conversation. I'm thankful for California Interfaith Power and Light for allowing you to be here as well, or encouraging you to be here as part of your new role in their organization, cutting out time in all the different things you have going on. I also want to thank our partners at the University of Southern California Center for Religion and Civic Culture. Megan is here from USC today. Thank you, Megan. So good to see you. I also want to thank all of you here at First Lutheran who are part of this community, who have made this possible, especially to Heather Davis, who encouraged us to do these crazy things and make it happen. So thank you to Heather for making it happen. Thanks also to Chuck for running our AV and sound, Rachel and Giovanni for rushing around. Thank you so much, everyone, for doing those little things. As we close tonight, as maybe we continue the conversation afterwards together here in the room, I was talking with a local artist who lives in Mar Vista a couple weeks ago about this event. And I asked him if he had one thing to share with us about it, what would he share? And he said this. He said, small things, little actions create a ripple. And he hoped this night, although he's not able to join us tonight, would be such a ripple. So as we maybe feel like this was just a little thing, just a small action, I hope it's a ripple. And I hope it can create more conversations, it can create more action, and more things that we can do together as a community in the future. Thanks so much for being part of it.